This morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 37. Jacob ended up settling in the land where his father had lived as a foreigner for many years, in the land of Canaan. Here now is the story of Jacob and his family. Joseph, when he was a young man of 17, often shepherded the flocks along with his brothers. One day, as he was with Bilhah's and Zilpah's sons, his now brothers, he decided to report back to their father the things they were doing wrong. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he came along when he was an old man. So Israel presented Joseph with a special robe he had made for him, a spectacularly colorful robe with long sleeves in it. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than the rest, they grew to hate him and couldn't find it in themselves to speak to him without resentment or argument. One day Joseph had a dream. When he told the dream to his brothers, they hated him even more. Please listen to this dream I had. There we were binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood up, and your sheaves all gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers were a little annoyed. Are you serious? You think you're somehow destined to reign over us? You think you're going to be our king? This dream and what he told them about it made them hate him even more. But Joseph had another dream, and he made the mistake of telling them about this dream too. Listen, I've had another dream. I saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to me. When he told this dream to his father and his brothers, even his father scolded him. What kind of dream is this? Do you actually think your mother and I and your brothers are going to bow down before you? Joseph's brothers had become extremely jealous of him. But his father, even though he scolded Joseph, kept this dream in the back of his mind. About this time, Joseph's brothers went north toward Shechem in search of a better pasture for their father's flocks. Israel to Joseph, aren't your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come on, then, I'll send you out to them to see how they are doing. Joseph replied, I'm ready, Father. Get going then. See if they're doing all right and make sure the flocks are well. When you get back, give me a report. With that, Israel sent Joseph out to the valley of Hebron. When he came to the area around Shechem, a man found him wandering around in a field. The man asked him what he was looking for. I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing our flock. Well, they've already gone. I heard them say they were going to Dothan. So Joseph hurried off and followed his brothers to Dothan.
And continuing on, in verse 18 of Genesis 37, his brothers saw him coming even though he was still a long way off. Before he was near enough to hear them, they conspired to kill him. Oh, here comes the great dreamer. Let's kill him, throw his body into one of the pits. Then we can tell everyone a wild animal killed and devoured him. We'll see then what becomes of his stupid dreams. When Reuben heard the plan, he tried to help Joseph. Let's not kill him. We don't need to shed any blood to be free of him. Let's just toss him into some pit here in the wilderness. We don't need to lay a hand on him. But Reuben thought that perhaps he could secretly come back later and get Joseph out of the pit, take him home to their father before any more harm came to him. The brothers agreed. When Joseph arrived, they ripped his robe off of him, the fancy, colorful robe he always wore that his father had made for him, and they threw him into the pit. Now, this pit happened to be an empty cistern. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. Soon they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelite traders approaching from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with gum, balm, and fragrant resin, and they were on their way down to Egypt with their goods. What profit will it be for us if we just kill our brother and conceal the crime? Judah said. Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites instead. We won't have to lay a hand on him then. He is, after all, our brother, our own flesh and blood. All of the brothers agreed. As the Midianite traders were passing by, they brought Joseph up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for about 8 ounces of silver, the usual price of young male slaves. The traders then set off with Joseph in the direction of Egypt. Now, Reuben hadn't been around when the caravan came by, so when Reuben came back to the cistern later and saw that Joseph wasn't there, he tore his clothing in agony and despair. He went back to his brothers. "The boy's gone. What do I do now? What am I supposed to tell Papa?" The brothers took Joseph's fancy, colorful robe, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped it in the blood. Then they took the special robe to their father. "We found this, Father. Tell us if you think this is Joseph's robe." "This is my son's robe. A wild animal must have killed and eaten him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to shreds." Then Jacob wailed in agony and tore his clothes with the depth of emotional pain only a father could feel upon losing a child. He dressed in sackcloth and mourned his son for a long time. All of his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No, I will go to the grave grieving for my son." This is how deeply Joseph's father grieved for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites arrived in Egypt and sold Joseph to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officers and the captain of the guard. This is the word of the Lord. Different is either loved or hated. Different is either loved or hated. A couple weeks ago, Rachel and I were out doing some yard work. She likes to mow, and so she was doing that. And my job, my chore, my task was to trim the hedges. Now, it seems like no big deal, but I've never trimmed hedges before. Never had hedges to trim. And so I was like, how hard could it be? So I go to the garage and I get a little pair of snips and I come around to the front of the house and I start snipping away. About 50 snips later, I quickly am realizing that the more that I snip, the more that I notice are sticking up. Well, there surely must be a quicker way to do this. So I go back to the garage, I get the big guns, I bring out the hedge trimmer, plug it in, and I begin sculpting a beautiful hedge. And by the time I was done, it was nice, it was smooth. No hedge sprout that was sticking up was left. Everything was uniform. Different is either loved or hated. And sometimes people fear being different because we're afraid that if we stick up too much, if we stand out, we will get cut down. But not Joseph. I apologize, I don't have a coat of many colors, nor is my shirt of many colors long-sleeved. It's the best I could do. Some of you are so thrown off just by the color, the clashing, that you can barely focus on a word that I'm saying. Today we're going to be in Genesis, believe it or not, chapter 37. So if you have a Bible, turn there, please. Genesis 37. Now, we have been following a man by the name of Jacob. Everybody say Jacob.
Jacob.
Yeah. We've been following Jacob for a long time, several weeks. And today, we come to a different spot in the story. Look at Genesis 37, starting with verse 1. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. That little phrase, that statement, this is the account of Jacob, is a marker, a bookend. It's basically saying, this is where Jacob's story ends. Everything that you've read up to this point has been the account of Jacob, but we're about to go a new direction. In fact, Jacob will be mentioned about a third of the amount of times that his son Joseph will be mentioned in the rest of Genesis. Jacob had an important story, but his story is about to be done. So we turn to a new character, one named Joseph. Verse 2, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about him. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. He made him a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Jacob loved Joseph. And if you're not familiar with the story, I'll catch you up very quickly. Jacob got married way back when. He fell in love. He met a girl named Rachel. Everybody say Rachel.
Rachel.
If you want to, you can look at her. Rachel. And when he met Rachel, it was love at first sight. There were turtle doves and all sorts of things. And Jacob decided, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get this girl to marry me. And so he actually worked for 7 years. Say 7 years.
7 years.
7 years for his soon-to-be father-in-law, just for the right to marry Rachel. But he loved her that much, and so each day it went by so quickly. He didn't even pay any attention to it. But after that 7 years is up, you know the story. Jacob, gets things mixed up on wedding night, and he ends up marrying the wrong sister. Oh, that's a terrible thing. And so he gets mad. He says, how could this happen? And his father-in-law says, I'm sorry. And so Jacob decides, you know what? I will work another 7 years. Say 7 years.
7 years.
Just for the right to marry Rachel. And so he works another 7 years. Jacob loved Rachel. But for a long time, Rachel wasn't able to have any children. She was barren. Everybody say barren.
Barren.
I'm just trying to keep you awake till the air conditioners get rolling. She was barren, and so there was this kind of anxiety, this angst, this desperate need for children. And so Jacob and Rachel, they're upset. The other wife and her maids, and it's a big, long, confusing story, but all these other people are having kids, and Rachel isn't. And finally, after years and years of desperately trying to get pregnant, Rachel gets pregnant with a son named Joseph. And so, naturally, since Jacob loved Rachel more than any of these other extra wives that he got stuck with, he loves Joseph. He begins to play favorites within his own family. Now, this wasn't just, giving an extra slice of cake or letting the other kids stay up later. It was a little different than that. See, when Jacob finally left his in-laws and came back home, I am glad to be home, by the way. When Jacob finally left his in-laws and was on his way back home, he knew that his brother, whom he had tricked, if you remember this, nod your head, knew that his brother, his brother whom he had tricked, was threatening to kill him. And so, you remember what he did. He took his big, huge party, all his resources, all his animals, all his servants and wives and kids, and he divided them up into several groups. And he said, Bilhah, Zilpah, you guys are like the extra wives that nobody cares about. You take your kids and you go up front. And where the battle could get the worst. Leah, I know you're Rachel's sister, but, we're not really that close, but you have a lot of kids, so we'll put you in the middle. But Rachel and Joseph, you guys hang near the back with me. So already, at an early stage, even before the famous coat of many colors, Jacob is playing favorites. And you'd be lying to yourself if you think that the other brothers don't notice. Now, Jacob loved his son, but his brothers hated him. Hated. That word hated appears again and again and again in Genesis chapter 37. And so what I want to do this morning is we're going to take an in-depth look and figure out why they hated Joseph. We know he was different, but why? Well, the first thing in Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, Joseph, young man of 17, he's a young pup, was tending the flocks with his brothers. He's a shepherd, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about him. Joseph had integrity. Now, we don't know what these boys were doing out in the fields, okay? We don't know if they were hanging out with the wrong crowd. We don't know if they were beating up the sheep. We don't know if they spray painted them pink. We don't know what they were doing. But whatever it was bad. And Joseph, being a man of integrity, a young man of integrity, comes back and he tells Dad what had happened. Have you ever been told on? Somebody narcs on you? Have you ever done something and you thought you were getting away with it, but then little brother goes in and he tattles? Yeah. Our first reaction is not one of love, is it? No. Joseph had integrity. There was no compromising the truth for Joseph. See, he was the son of promise. He was more interested in what God wanted, and so he was going to tell the truth no matter what it cost. There was a time, at one point, where pastors used to do the same thing. But now, it's so easy for pastors to milk down and water down the gospel so that it's accepted by everybody. That way we can fill the pews and fill the seats and fill the attendance records and fill the offering plate just as long as everybody's happy. There used to be a time when teachers would tell the truth and they would try and chase after the truth. They were actually more interested in helping the students learn how to learn rather than only teaching when it came time for the state tests. I had a teacher this past week who was fired after 34 years. 34 years at one school. Fired because she was accused of being a bully. She pushed the kid too hard academically. Wow. How soft have we become? There was a time when parents were more interested in helping their children become sensible, respectable, and respectful adults rather than trying to get a little buddy who likes them. There's a song that says, "You've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything." What do you stand for? Integrity? Because if you do, that'll make you different. And different is either loved or hated. Well, that's not the only thing that Joseph's brothers hated about him. He was different because he had integrity, but he was different for another reason. Genesis 37, starting with verse 4. Verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph was different because he was blessed. Joseph was loved deeply by his father. And that type of love was different than Jacob showed to any of his other sons. And they noticed it. And not just a hug and a "I love you, son," and "I'm going to give you a little bit." It was Jacob gave Joseph extra stuff. Now, in my family, there was always this stigma: we've got to be fair. We've got to be fair. Everybody, if you get something, you got to get something. Well, in this family, that didn't happen. Joseph gets a sweet coat. It probably matched better than this. Some of you are still distracted by the top. Pay attention. It says in the NIV that Jacob gave Joseph a richly ornamented robe, a coat of many colors, as we like to call it. And we don't know exactly what this looked like. In fact, the only other time that it's used in Scripture outside of this story is in 2 Samuel, where it talks about a king's daughter wearing a richly ornamented robe. So whatever this is, it's very valuable. It's noble. It's almost royal. Something above and beyond what a little shepherd boy should have. And the brothers hated Joseph because of that. Do you know the difference between being spoiled and being blessed? The difference between being spoiled and being blessed is your expectations. Your expectations. For instance, I attended Lincoln Christian University. And when I was getting ready to go to school, I sat down with my parents and they said, "We will pay for your college. On one condition. You have to get good grades. Work your tail off. Do the best that you can." All right? And I did. I didn't ask for that. And I recognize that not everybody gets that. Not everybody is blessed in that way. But I know some people who were. Who their mom and their dad paid for their schooling. And you know what they decided to do? They shrugged it off like it was no big deal. Skipped class. Stayed up late. Partied. That's okay. It's just thousands of dollars being wasted. See, they expect to be doted on. They expect things to be handed to them. They don't want to work for it. They don't want to try for it. They just want to have it. They're spoiled. Now, I don't know what you've been given. Maybe you've been blessed with financial security. Maybe you've been blessed with a big family. Maybe you've been blessed with a stable job. Maybe you've been blessed with a loving wife or a loving husband. Maybe you survived some terrible illness. Maybe you survived some terrible accident. Whatever it is, if you have been blessed, don't be ashamed of it. But just recognize the blessing and the one who was given it. You remember Job. In Job chapter 1, Job was a guy who had a big family, had a big house, had lots of property and stuff. And one terrible day, through a series of unfortunate events, everything comes crashing down. Kids are killed, houses destroyed, land and animals and everything taken away from him. And you know what Job does? He shaves his head, tears his clothes, and it says he falls down in worship. And he basically says, "God, I don't know everything. I thank you for what you've given me. And I recognize that you give and you take away. I came into this world with nothing and I will leave with nothing. May the name of the Lord be praised." Wow. Sometimes, if you see your life and your world as a series of blessings, and you live that reality out, it will make you different. And different is either loved or hated. Joseph had something else that made him different in Genesis chapter 37. Joseph had dreams. Starting with verse 5, excuse me. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told this one to his brothers as well. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come down and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous. Joseph had a couple dreams here. His first dream involved harvest. It involved he being out with his brothers out in the field like normal. They were gathering grain. And Joseph's bundle, his sheaf, was standing upright, and it grew, and it was huge and abundant and successful. And all of his brothers, their work, their sheaves, their grain, everything fell, bowed, paled in comparison. His second dream was on a much bigger scale, a cosmic scale, a universal scale. It says, "The sun, the moon, and the stars bowed down to me." The sun, which was at that point in culture seen as the head of all the universe. The moon, which was like the second in command. And the stars, which were like little suns, bow down to Joseph. And did you see the difference in reaction here? The brothers, they hated him. They were jealous. They had this strong negative reaction. And when his father, Jacob, heard about this dream, he rebuked Joseph. But notice what it said. It said, he rebuked him, and while the brothers were jealous, Jacob, his father, kept the matter in mind. Now, why do you suppose he would do that? Jacob, not too long ago, had a dream. You remember this? He dreamed he saw a staircase with angels going up and down the staircase. He had, a few years later, had some sort of dream or vision or metaphysical experience where he wrestled with a man all night long who turned out to be God. Jacob experienced God through his dreams. And so when his son Joseph says that he has these strange dreams, Jacob sits back and wonders, is it possible? Somehow God is speaking to Joseph, my son, in the same way. When God calls, do you answer or do you put him on hold? When God calls, do you answer or do you put him on hold? I was recently reading a book about a man named Patrick. And Patrick was a Chinese American. He worked at a law firm as a lawyer, was a very successful individual. He was winning cases, he was gaining fame, he had a good pay. Everything was going well for him. And somewhere along the line, he felt the call to go to ministry as a full-time profession. And so he attended seminary, got his degree, and became a pastor. Now, for any of us looking at this story, we think, wow, man, what faith. But you need to understand the depth of this decision. Patrick was Chinese. He came from a background where the male's role and respect and honor and power and wealth was incredibly, incredibly important and ingrained in who you were in society. He could be kicked out of his family for running away from a promising career like this. To become a pastor? When God calls, do you answer? Or do you put him on hold? When God says, I want you to volunteer for this, they need some help over there, and you can do it. When God says, look, I know you've got this question, this issue, this theme that is just eating away inside of you. It's like you want to explore it. You want it to get out. You want to discuss and learn and grow and discover. I want you to lead a class on that. I want you to start a conversation about that. When God says, I want you to leave a church of 1,000 and go to a town of 1,000. When God calls, will you answer or put him on hold? Joseph suffered for being different. And if you're willing to answer God, that'll make you different too. And different is either loved or hated. Joseph quickly realized that. There was one day his brothers were out tending the sheep near Shechem, which is interesting why they're there. If you remember a couple weeks ago, they just ran away from Shechem because they slaughtered an entire town and worried about retribution. But his brothers were out tending the sheep, and Jacob sends his son, his faithful son, his son that has integrity, to go check on him. Joseph runs off, no big deal. He can't find them. It turns out the boys aren't where they're supposed to be. Seems to be a common theme. And he has to go another day further to find them. When the boys see Joseph coming, they begin to have this discussion. Let's kill him. Here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him. He's different than us. He's willing to hold to his values and his morals and his truth. He's willing to accept God's love and accept Dad's love. And somehow he's having conversations with God. Let's kill him. And there's so much that can be explored here. They throw him into an empty well. The author makes sure to tell us that there was no water in there, so it probably hurt as he's banging his way down. He's probably baking in the sun. The boys eat a meal while their brother is down in this hole. Apparently they weren't in too big of a hurry. The oldest son, Reuben, he wants to come back and rescue Joseph so that he can get back on Dad's good side. Some Ishmaelite traders come by. You recognize that name, don't you? Ishmael, the son of Abraham, the son of the Egyptian maid Hagar. The ones who were sent away because they were a reminder of how God's people sometimes try and do God's work without God involved. These traders come by and the brothers decide, hey, here's an opportunity for us to make money. Notice how the tone changes as soon as there's a possibility to make money on this. They were all gung-ho. Let's kill him. Let's beat him up. Let's destroy him. Let's get rid of the dreamer. But then as soon as they realize they can make a profit, their tone changes and they say, well, let's not kill him. He is our brother after all. And we'll get more money if he's in good shape. And so they sell their own brother. They take his coat of many colors and they rip it to shreds. They dip it in goat's blood. Goat's blood. In order to deceive their father into thinking that Joseph was dead. Isn't it interesting that Jacob is deceived by a goat? Do you remember several weeks back when Jacob first steals the birthright from his brother? He tricks his dad into thinking that he was his brother. And what does he do? He covers his arms and his neck with goat skin, so that his father will think he's his hairy brother. Jacob cries, he weeps, he moans, he goes into this deep depression. He doesn't want to be comforted. He says, I will go to the grave with my son. Different is either loved or hated. And in this story, there is so much scheming, so much deceiving, so much hatred over one who is different. But you know what? Those who are different are those who make a difference. Let me say that again. Those who are different are those who will make a difference. The people that just blend in, that are common, that don't want to stand up above the crowd, that don't want to stand up for what they believe in, those are the people that history forgets. But the people who are different, who say, you know what? I'm not going to just let this happen. I'm going to recognize this. I'm going to stand up for this. I'm going to do this differently. Those people make a difference in the world and in the lives of those around them. Maybe it's loving the unlovable. Maybe it's initiating a conversation that is difficult. Maybe it's giving without expecting anything in return. That's different. Different is set aside. Different is special. Different is sometimes unpopular. Different is a rabbi eating with sinners. Different is a God who dies for his people. Different is a dead man coming back to life. Different is a young church empowered by the Spirit of God, celebrating a resurrection and sharing that with everyone they meet. Different is a teenager recognizing the importance of a relationship with his parents. Different is a husband treating his wife better than he treats himself. Different is a wife lifting up her husband, both publicly and privately. Different is a senior mentoring and guiding the life of a young person. Different is holy. Different is love. Different is Pentecost. Different is Park Street Church. Different is for God's glory, not my own vain attempt at fame. It's not a chasing after my own glory. It's not different just for difference sake or different for shock value. It's different because I'm called to be. Joseph's story is just beginning. You saw that little red flag at the end of Genesis 37 where it says, meanwhile, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, who was the captain of the Egyptian guard. It's like, hold on. The story's not over. It's just beginning. And so is your story and my story. And so the question is, will you be different? Or will you just blend in? Let me pray. God, we thank you for today. We thank you for this opportunity to recognize how important it is to sometimes be different, to do things that are different, to live in a different way than maybe the rest of the world lives. To see a situation or a lifestyle or a person or a problem and say, you know what? That isn't who God has called me to be. I'm someone else. I'm someone new. I'm someone different. I'm not going to do that. Father, give us strength to stand up. Give us courage to stand out for you, not for ourselves. It is in your Son's name that we pray.